district, so he was going to. Bobby Krim was getting all over the state. He just told me, this is what we've done. I went back and wrote the story, wrote an analysis piece, and threw it in the drawer. And 2 or 3 months later, the Supreme Court ruling came down. And so we took a look at it and put a 2-paragraph top on that and ran it. And, bulletin, urgent, and all that stuff. And then we got up and walked to the other side of the Capitol, the press room, where everybody's going absolutely crazy trying to figure out what's happened. And we said, oh, are you still working on that story?
That was the last map that was written without the help of computers. I remember the look on Bernie Porn's face. He was on the House staff when we got our first computers and those wonderful data points, which by today's standards were incredible. A 10 meg hard drive cost $10,000. It'll give you an idea of how things have changed a little bit. 10 megs, not 10 gigs or anything like that. But Bernie all of a sudden one day comes in and he says, you got to see this program I got. It was the precursor to Excel. It's called Multiplane. And he's going nuts with census tracts, feeding them into this thing and realizing all the trouble he can cause. Writing maps, because he can do what ifs forever, whereas before that 71 plan was basically done with adding machines and people using their political instincts. They didn't have to after that. And that kind of changed a lot of things too, created so many safe districts because they could be so precise in developing it. If they told you it was a 52% district, it was. And that I think that really changed the system an awful lot.
Roberta, how about the Senate cages?
Okay.
Oh, Lord. And the senator from the 39th? I'll let one of you take that on.
Papa Joe?
It
Well,
was
yeah,
Bob
go to the
Longstaff.
cages first in the Senate when they put the glass up. You're talking on the gallery. That's when they decided that they wanted to sort of keep the peanut gallery a little bit farther back. And it was Gary Schuster and Tom Green who went up there and said, "Let's bring in some hockey sticks and bang bang on the glass."
Well, they were going to change the rules. They were going to put up the barriers, and also, as a reporter, you always had access to the Senate and House floor. You just wander around during session. And the plan was to limit that. Mm-hmm. And so when we wrote the first story about the plan, we used the word cage. And it's an example of branding, that they were going to cage the press. Well, once we had that story out there, they had lost.
And then they ended up
abandoning the plan.
And ended up putting in TV lights instead, so
Right.
that at least they'd be on notice when Tom was filming because the lights would go on. Before the days when you could use available light, Tom would turn the lights on with the permission of the majority.
I think what Roberta's talking to is there actually was a member of the press corps who had worked with them to develop the plan.
Yeah. A little unapproachable at times. I'll open up to any of you, any topics that you'd like to talk about.
Let's talk about outrageous things that have happened on the floor. Oh, we can all throw one in on that. Not all of them are very funny. The most shocking thing that I ever witnessed as a reporter, and I tell people this story to this day, and their mouths just hang open, was when a legislator was having a particularly nasty divorce, and his wife burst through the doors past the sergeant-at-arms screaming, "I want the dog, I want the dog," which would have been funny, except for the fact that the sergeant-at-arms who wrestled her essentially to the ground immediately dropped dead of a heart attack.
Well, and who can forget the marijuana debate featuring Perry Bullard and Rosetta Ferguson. Perry from Ann Arbor, a liberal; Rosetta Ferguson, a God-fearing woman who talked about little kids were going to find marijuana joints, and they were going to get marijuana drunk.
They're selling the refrigerator.
Yeah, sell the refrigerator.
And so Perry Bullard looked at her, and he, honest to God, this is 1979. This bill almost passed the House to legalize marijuana. I mean, it was a vote or two away from actually happening. And Perry Bullard got up and told her that her argument was ignorant. And she thought that he was calling her ignorant. So she picked up, at that point, you could smoke in the chambers, and every lawmaker had a big glass ashtray on his or her desk. And so she picked this up, came on and whooped him topside the head. And he was just sort of shocked, and then she comes back and smacks him one or two other times. So I was the bill went down, and an analysis I did that weekend, Joe Forbes, the floor leader, said that Perry Bullard was his own worst enemy for killing that bill. He could have just kept his mouth shut. But Rosetta, I wrote a story that was on the front page, and she ended up, when she left the legislature, drafting a resolution in praise for me. You know, it was BS, but it sounded, I think he might have wrote it. I said, I couldn't have said that better myself. And, you know, and I finally asked her, I said, why did you do that? I didn't do anything special for you. She says, because you're the only person who came by my office afterwards and asked me my side of the story. And I thought, well, good for Rosetta.
She may have also been involved in an episode that back in the 70s when streaking became a big craze. People running
Streaker in the
nude
house, yeah.
out in public. We had the streaker of the house, and he came barreling into the chamber and immediately encountered Rosetta. It was a nice Christian lady who was just appalled and screeched out loud as he went out the other door.
What about the Senate
And
fisticuffs?
he would have gotten
Yeah.
away with it, but he decided to try and
Train-
hang around to be interviewed. Arrested.
What about the Senate fisticuffs? John Kelly and Gil.
Oh, yeah. John Kelly and Gil Dinello were a couple of hotheads, and in committee even. One time Kelly just tore after Dinello and was like on his back, beating him up with his fist. And I don't even know what the issue was on
I don't
that.
know
It was
either.
like
Might have been bad hair, bad wig.
And they both afterwards claimed they won the fight.
They won the
I
fight.
got him. I got
Yeah.
him.
Then there was John McCauley, great senator, great drinker, not necessarily in that order. One night he's really tanked up, and in the House there was a state representative who had won in a special election from the Traverse City area by the name of Richard Frisky, and he had noted in his campaign biography that he was a World War II veteran, which he was. Failed to mention he fought for the Germans, but he was a veteran. And one night, Macaulay's feeling no pain. It's one of those late night sessions, and of course, back then, I remember getting stoned in Basil Brown's office one night. Everybody had a full bar in their office, except Ballinger, of course. You were straight. Well, I'm not too sure about that either. But Macaulay was feeling no pain. He comes into the House chamber, and we were waiting for something. And he goes over to Frisky, says, and he looks and says, "Frisky, you son of a bitch." He tears out his prosthetic arm from his sleeve. He bangs it on the desk. "You son of a bitch. What the hell did you guys do with my arm?" And left. He had lost it in World War II, and apparently he thought Frisky was personally responsible for storing it for him all those years. But Macaulay was another one of those guys. If you get him sober, which was most of the time, at least during the day, he got some good legislation through. But he was a piece of work.
I was sitting in the House press room typing up a story one day. I was working for Panex Newspapers, which was my first real job out of college, and my boss was Don Hohenschel. And he was just a great guy. And he and I were sitting next to one another typing. Yes, we actually typed on, yellow copybooks at that point. And I had written a story, and I know that Dave Dempsey gives the Free Press credit on this, but I actually broke this story because Don gave it to me, essentially. What did I know? But we had broken a story that Jimmy Del Rio, who was a representative from Detroit, his girlfriend, Glenda McGuire, was going to be named the first head of the Michigan Women's Commission. And she was a lovely person, but she frankly was not qualified for the job. And Jimmy Dell found out about this, and and after the story was published, he came screeching into the press room next to me, really threatening. And I, sitting down, I'm about as tall as he was standing up, but he's yelling at me, and he's going like this. And Hohenschel sitting next to me going, "Let him hit you. Let him hit you. We'll sue him." And I was appalled, and I was even more appalled years later when he became a judge and would wave his gun around in the courtroom. So I don't know whether he was armed at that particular point, but he was threatening.
Bob, would you address the quote board?
Oh, God.
Whatever happened to the quote?
I don't know. Did you keep
I-
that?
Larry has
it's
it.
still in the archives at Gongor,
Oh, we started.
yellowing and tattered.
Yeah, it started sort of by accident, and I can't remember the first quote. I think it was, I can't remember who said it, but that there's three branches of government: the House, the Senate, and the governor.
Sounds like Harvard.
And so we put it on a piece of yellow paper and put it up on a bulletin board, and then people started coming in and adding to it, and it got very long.
You had to establish rules for this
We had
thing.
to establish rules. It was very there, and you couldn't just come in and do it on your own. You had to be reviewed reviewed before it got put up
That was
there.
before this stuff.
But we had a very lengthy list by the time I left the press room.
Wasn't there one, we met the enemy and the enemy is us?
Mm-hmm.
Several of the best ones were from Cartwright, Senator Art
Mhm.
Cartwright from Detroit.
I think that was him.
Yeah, what I can remember two. One was the fax is beginning to submerge.
This ain't only dishonest, it's disfair.
It's just fair.
And why are we worrying about the Ozark layer?
Yeah,
And this was actually, this quote board was used, I know of 2 occasions by Johnny Carson in his monologue. He talked about the Michigan
I
quote
remember
board.
who was the candidate who, when asked about euthanasia, said that they have as much rights as anyone else. Or they should have as much right as anyone else.
Any final comments, and then we'll open it up to a few minutes of questions.
No, you talk about the problems we've had with the budget in '07 and then again this year, and then we look to the future, and because of term limits, in next year's election, 29 of the 38 senators will be elected, will be new, that's 76%. 34 of the 110 House members, that's 30%. Good luck.
On that note, questions in the audience? Yes, Richard?
Since we're talking about the 70s and 80s, I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about the impact, if any, of Open Meetings Act, Freedom of Information Act, and the campaign finance laws. Did they really affect how you did your business? You know, there was all this hype about Open Meetings Act and FOIA was going to open up government. Did it?
There are always ways to get around all those, and in some cases, particularly FOIA, made our jobs actually harder, because the rules came down that if you wanted anything, you had to FOIA it, where previously you might have been able to just talk to somebody into it. That has been, I think, somewhat offset by the rise of the internet. You know, there's a lot more information available to you very easily now than was back then. You might have had to wait for 3 or 4 weeks to get hard copy of spending or travel documents or something like that. That's pretty easily gotten right now.
Open meetings did make things better, at least to put people on the record in open about what they were doing. Decisions could still get made in back rooms always, and like you say, you can get around it. But there were times when the Senate Appropriations Committee would just be meeting behind a locked door, and that's where the budget was being decided and voted on.
I think more of the impact sometimes on reporters who wanted to emulate the news and win a Pulitzer Prize or be the next Woodward and Bernstein was that sometimes because we could get information more easily at times, that the mundane and the trivial became front page or headline news on the air, simply because we were able to get it and nobody else had it. It was more that we had gotten it first rather than it really was all that important in the big scheme of things, and it might have hindered us sometimes, especially more so now when you simply don't have the time to cover things like they were covered then. You know, when you're talking, Booth had, 4 or 5 reporters, and the News had one.
The
We
Detroit News
had more than a dozen.
We had 13 reporters at one point,
Oh.
which is really pretty ridiculous when you think about it. We were stumbling over one another. But the thought of the newspaper hierarchy at that point was that the state capitol was the new town hall, was the new city hall. And we smothered it. And now you look at all the bureaus, and everybody's, just down to practically nothing now.
But it's so easy to get distracted by the trivia, and we see it every day. And perhaps open meetings has contributed to that. Perhaps freedom of information has contributed to that, where everybody's thinking, well, if I keep trying, I'm going to find the next big scandal. And sometimes it's happening right in front of them, but it's they miss it because they're tied up with something else.
When I went to my next job in Detroit after Governor Milliken with Mayor Young, I learned that if you've got a good attorney, you can make people go through all kinds of, turn themselves into all kinds of knots before you have to turn anything over. I remember once Bruce Alpert, who was the news reporter covering City Hall, asked for a list of the appointee salaries of all the department heads. And it took him 4 months to write the request in a way that we finally legally had to comply with.
Yes.
With regard to your experience on Panax, I know John McGough came under some fire for not only his political views, but at least is alleged to have tried to influence the editorial policy of some of the newspapers he owned. Was that ever a problem at Panax?
I wasn't frankly there long enough to really know.
John's bark was a lot worse than his bite. And my experience working with him, things kind of blew up after I left, and they had the big problem up in the UP where people resigned and were fired and all that stuff. But I never had a problem with him. I mean, you'd sit down and talk to him, and he might say he wanted something, but sometimes a good employee doesn't do what his boss tells him to do initially. And you could use, I mean, I found out I could sit down. I remember once Joe Mack called him up, and he was just really angry. He was trying to get me fired. And John said, was out there, and John said, I got a call from Joe Mack that he's really pissed at you. I said, well, I guess we've got his attention, don't we, John? And he kind of looked, oh, yeah, I guess we do. So I never, I mean, John could rant and rave, but I never had, in terms of a boss and him trying to tell me what to do, he never dictated a word that appeared under my bylaw.
Kathy?
I just want to ask them a little bit, because when I first started, you could wander through any, department building, if you wanted to go talk to somebody that you would talk to for a story, I mean, you just wandered up to their office. Now you can't even get into a building and walk up to somebody's office by yourself. They have to send somebody down to escort you. And there's just, I think it started more under Engler, but certainly it's been done under Granholm as well, where you just can't, even though they have, spokespeople for all the departments, half the time you find yourself talking to Liz Boyd these days anyway. You call the press spokesperson, they're like, well, you gotta go for that to the governor's office. And I'm just curious, your thoughts about this gradual constriction of who's allowed to be a gatekeeper and who you can, it just makes it so much harder to find out anything, I think. And I'm just wondering what you're thinking about that.
Well, I agree totally that that gatekeeping and the message, because each administration increasingly wanted to control the message going out, and heaven forbid you have somebody in the administration just talking honestly about what they were doing, which would happen if you were going in, even on a background basis. So, yeah, it has. This one probably is the most restrictive because, like you say, a lot of stuff does have to go back through the governor's office itself, but it gradually did come to, first you had to just talk to a spokesperson to try to get access to, maybe not even a director, but somebody who was just in a program area.
Yeah. What about the demise of the House press room, or the Capitol press room? Why and how did it happen? Was it inevitable?
They claimed it was simply a matter of space, that their needs outgrew what they had, and we were sort of expendable. Now, for some people, I mean, the news and the free press had the money. They had the money then to go out and rent their own digs. But for some other people, smaller, particularly I think of some of the radio guys used to hang their hats there. It was really problematic for them because they didn't have the money to go get an office someplace else. So we were kind of chased out, So. But they claimed it was the needs. But look at it, Ben. You didn't have the Senate office building. You didn't have the House office buildings back then. I mean, so the needs, the space needs have, grown tremendously. So
When I first got there, the House members, I think it was one secretary per 4 House members was the standard. And they basically had a big bullpen in the center of the Capitol, and it's grown exponentially. And part of it was a space need, but I think getting people, the proximity was a threat. It was just, we made it too easy to cover, and it had to be a little bit more removed from the perspective of those who were being covered.
I never figured out how we lost our parking spots. The number of lawmakers didn't grow. It's still 110 in House 38 in the Senate. How come I lost my spot?
Now that's a real loss.
It is.
Did it make it harder for you to cover the Capitol, not even be there right in the building with your office there?
It sure made it convenient to be there. Sure made it convenient,
Well, an issue at that time was one of ethics, that the legislature was subsidizing the press by providing them.
You played a role in this, Pat? You got us kicked out of there?
It was also, that was prime office space.
That was an issue.
Could be.
Free space from government.
Well, why didn't they charge us?
We paid for the parking spots, so.
We did pay
No, we
too,
did.
didn't we? Yes, we did.
I
Yes,
didn't.
we did.
You were radio.
We did.
Did you
Every
pay the
month.
going rate?
Yeah.
Tim?
Well, one of the things you're talking about coincides with a period of time when the staff increased tremendously. What impact do you think that had on the increase?
It probably made it more professional. I'm sure it did. But it further insulated the lawmakers from the media and others. You know, it was just another layer, you know, between you and access to the actual person who had to push the green or the red button. So like all good things, there's good and bad in it.
I'm not sure that it improved the product, though, if you look at the legislation that was passed in the 70s and early 80s and what's happened since then.
Yes. As someone who's been a staffer in both the House and the Senate since 1980, one of the things as a staffer